In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take an image like this and turn it into something like this. Obviously, I've covered the CRT circuit bending in Photoshop before, but I now have 2 months worth of emails, DMs, comments, and things like that about specific issues people might have struggled with when trying to get the same results that I get from this effect. So this video is going to address every single issue or problem that I've been sent all in one video, so that anyone who couldn't do it before, or if you want to just improve your work in this style, then I'm going to help you do that basically. To get started straight away, just go to studioAAA.com/CRT, scroll down and make sure you have the free version selected because that's all you'll need. You get instant download access after checkout, so just get that. You only need the free version, and once you have that downloaded, you can install the ATN file by double clicking it with Photoshop open, or you can go to Window and just make sure Actions is ticked, and then you'll get this little panel pop up in your Photoshop's UI. From here, you can just click these 3 dots and go to Load Actions and just navigate to wherever you saved the file on your computer, and it'll pop up with this folder that says CRT Effects Kit May Update Studio AAA. Now, the action that I'm going to be talking to you about today is just this Advanced CRT Bend Create Effect action. So that's the only one you're going to need to run for this video. I'm just going to dock that back into my Photoshop's UI so it's out of the way. So the first variable or issues that people had with this effect would depend largely on the type of document that you use. The effects in this action rely on filter gallery, so that is only available in an 8-bit RGB document. Don't ask me why, it's not something I programmed into the action, it's just how Photoshop works. So you're going to need an 8-bit RGB document for this effect to work properly, so just make sure in your color mode you've got RGB and 8-bit selected. The next thing is, obviously, as I said, because it relies on filter gallery, the filter gallery effects scale depending on your document size. So if you use a really small document size for creating the effect, that means that the filter gallery steps that Photoshop will run early on in the action will basically be outputting something that the later steps in the action are not expecting. So I'm going to recommend that you work in at least 2160 by 2160 and 300 dpi for your resolution. If for whatever reason you need to work in 16-bit or 72 dpi or CMYK or anything like that, just create the effect with these settings and then change it later. Literally will not work if you don't use this color mode. So yeah, I'm going to go for 2160, 2160, 300 dpi, RGB, 8-bit, and press create. The next variable is obviously your image. So I'm going to drag in this image of an eye. I got this from Unsplash. I will try and find the link and put it in the description if you want to work on this too. As well as relying on filter gallery, the effects in this action also rely on displacement and a threshold filter, which means that the luminosity of your image is going to determine what the output looks like. Now, I'll break that down in a way that actually makes sense if you're new to all these terms, but the 2 terms I'm going to use are bend and visibility. So I'll show an example for you now on screen, and I'll just highlight some of the areas that are useful for this. Bend is literally referring to, are the lines bending or are they straight? And visibility is referring to which areas of the image show the lines and which ones don't. Obviously, if you look at this example, we probably don't want lines here up at the top in this section, and we probably don't want any lines here down here. You just want the eyebrow kinda or the eyelid and the eye to show up in your output with the Scanlines or the CRT lines. Luminosity will help you determine all of this, and understanding how to control it and how it affects the output is what you're going to get from this video. So to go over bend first and how it works, basically every pixel in your image has a hue, saturation, and luminosity value. So if I just load up the color picker, you'll see here that H is probably ticked for you by default, but you've got H for hue, S for saturation, and L here for luminosity. So if I type 100 in on the L value, you'll see that's 100% white. If I type in 0, you can see that just goes to black. And if I move this slider up and down the black to white gradient, you will see that nothing really changes in hue and saturation, and it's only luminosity that changes. When we're working with digital images, any reference to luminosity is usually just referring to this slider basically. So displacement relies on luminosity because when we displace anything in Photoshop, we have a displacement map input and then an image layer that will be displaced by the input. When Photoshop interprets your displacement map, it does it in only black and white. So essentially it only views the luminosity data of the image, and the higher something is on the luminosity scale, the less it will displace the image that you're applying the displacement to, if that makes sense. So this means that a brighter area on your displacement map will come through by our effect as straighter lines in the result. Darker areas will then be more bendy. So this basically means that before you run the action, once you understand this, you can see that it's highly likely that we'll get lots of bending around here in the sort of fold of the eyelid, and we'll get a lot of straight lines here above the eyebrow and below the eyelid at the bottom. And then here in the middle, you know, where we've got these sort of browns and there's lots of like changes to the luminosity around the edges of the eye and stuff, that's where you'll get some of the more interesting details where the line goes from bendy to straight and then bendy again. So I'm going to run the action now just to prove that point to you. I'm only going to go with the default settings, so don't worry about following this along or anything like that. I'm not changing anything from the defaults. Like I said, I only ran that to prove my point, but as you can see, straight lines are appearing where the original image is white or has high luminosity, and then more bendy lines are appearing where the luminosity has changes and when it is just darker, basically. So displacement is basically just transferring the luminosity data and moving pixels based on that data. For our effect and for what we're doing, all we need to really understand is that if something is darker, it is more likely to bend the lines in your output, and if something is lighter, it is more likely to straighten the lines in your output. So the next control for bend is the Gaussian blur you apply. So I've deleted my output now, so I'm going to run the effect again. I'm just again going to go default everything until it asks me to blur. So it's easy to overthink this step, but just to basically explain, more blur on your image will result in a simpler displacement map and therefore simpler lines. Less blur on your image results in a more complex displacement map and therefore more complex lines. So if you want something to have lots of straight lines or only very subtle bends, then I would go for a higher blur or a more intense blur. If you want something to look very, very highly detailed and complex, then I would go for a lower intensity blur. Obviously, bearing in mind that with the lower intensity blur, the lines may stop bending and they might just look jagged instead. There's no real one answer I can give for the blur part of this effect, because obviously your image is going to be different to mine, and the luminosity and stuff that you've maybe edited at the beginning, if you've added like a curves layer or anything, they're all going to be different to mine. So if I go for something, again, this is just to prove my point rather than make something that looks bad deliberately. If I add a 0.1 radius Gaussian blur, which is basically no Gaussian blur at all, save my displacement map, and then when it prompts me, just reopen the same one, you'll see that the lines now where they would be curved and bendy are just jagged, and the input basically was too complex and it's not being smooth enough for the lines to look bendy or nice, basically. So luminosity and the strength of the Gaussian blur are essentially your controls for how bendy you want the lines to be. But luminosity also controls the visibility of the output. So as I said before, when I say visibility, I literally mean where the lines in the output are visible and where they are not, and just how you control which bits are going to come through in your end result. We have a little bit more control over this one, and it's a little bit more simple because when we run this action, you will notice that it prompts you a couple of times for threshold, but one of the times it prompts you for threshold, it turns your image completely black and white. So if I click again to run the action, so you got your first threshold, it's not this one, this is just for the lines. I'm just going to go with the default values for these first two. And if you just give it a second, it'll take you here. So the white areas of this preview are where the lines are going to be shown, and the dark areas are where the lines are going to be hidden. Now, for our example image that I've loaded up here, this isn't ideal because all the interesting areas are in black now, and the boring areas are just showing up in white. Obviously, as I said before, the lighter areas are going to have sort of more boring lines. So I'm a little bit stuck here here for what I can do. But again, just to prove my point, if I just make the whole thing white and press OK, you'll see in a minute that the lines will just appear everywhere basically. So I'm just going to go for the default Gaussian blur. Just bear with me while I do the rest of the steps. So we've got like blanket visibility. It looks rubbish. It's boring. It's not ideal for getting this to look realistic. So if we double click into the CRT bend effect, it takes you first to the glow controls, and then if you double click the base layer again, you've got this layer that is called overlay. This is the layer that we were just applying the threshold to. So if we now double click into this and click on the threshold, we can now make changes to the visibility. So if I just put that somewhere in the middle, and then with the layer selected, just press Control and I, now we've got inverted luminosity, which means that if we need darker pixels for interesting displacement, but lighter pixels for visibility, inverting your overlay, depending on what kind of input image or what your like desired effect is, can help. And obviously in this case, I want the eye to show up where the interesting displacement is. I don't want all this skin on the forehead to be what's sort of highlighted in this piece. I just want the eye, basically. That's all I want. So you can tweak the threshold and your invert, and you can even go and add more filters if you want. It's totally up to you. Now I've inverted it. If I just do Control S to save the smart object, close that, Control S again to save that one, and then Control S again to save the glow, and come back, and now rather than having that flat, boring, straight lines everywhere output, we've got this output which is only really the interesting areas of the nice bendy, distorted lines that are showing up instead. So again, this is always going to depend on what you're working on, or you know what your input is, but the effect that is generated with this action, there is no effort made to hide this from you or to make it difficult, or like you don't get anything. It's not as if all these controls are hidden. Yeah, you can go in and change everything here. It's really easy to do. Obviously, when you've made changes to the luminosity and the threshold and stuff like that, you might just need to go and increase the light intensity of the glow, because obviously you've effectively made the image darker. So yeah, you can go in here and do that with the curves or with the Gaussian blur that I've set up. Those are the controls for the bend and the visibility for this effect. The last thing I'm going to go over is the actual lines themselves. Just going to pull in a different example image and run the action, and the first few options you get are all related to the lines. You can mess with this threshold to control like the thickness and the frequency of the lines, but this is another example of something that is just easier to edit at the end. So I'm going to go with the default value, which is 142 for both of my sets of lines. I'm just going to go with default everything else for this one as well. So I've done the default threshold, the default Gaussian blur, and default for displacement as well. This is the output. So if I again double click into my smart objects and get to this bit where the overlay layer is that I showed you before, below the overlay you've got the blending group and these two layers that are the actual lines themselves. So you can double click into either one of these. As you can see, I've got the vertical lines as my chosen sort of one here. So I'm going to double click into the vertical, and these are the actual lines that are making up that image. These lines are just being flipped and then displaced. This is the source of the entire effect. So if I click on any of these smart filters now, any changes I make are gonna like quite heavily affect everything. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't or can't mess with it, but if you do, like, you might just break it. But that's kind of fine, because if you know how to break something, then you know how it works basically. So I'm going to double click on the filter gallery at the bottom, and you'll see you get this halftone pattern with a size of 5, contrast of 0. So if you wanted to turn the size up to 9, you can do that and press OK. You've got bigger lines now. Bigger lines also means less lines because it can't fit as many lines on the screen. So if you wanted less lines but you didn't want the lines to be bigger, you increase the size of the lines like we just did to 9, and then you can come to the threshold and tune the threshold so the lines are still just as thin as they were before, and you've effectively got less lines now. So if we do Control S to save, exit that, and just keep exiting back in to our original, you'll see the image is more simple. We've got far less lines. If we go back in all the way again now and make the lines thicker, this is probably going to look awful, but the image has some more clarity, especially around the areas where we had lots of luminosity in the beginning. If we go in again and let's say we want loads of lines, so like size 1, as you can see it changes it to black, and that's because you're going to have to go and make some changes to the rest. So if I disable the Gaussian blur and the minimum, you can see the lines are really subtle. And then if I move the threshold over, so we've got tons of lines now and they're really thin. There's every chance that this just breaks the whole thing, but again, if you exit, save, exit, and now you've got this very, very high detail, lots of lines output that conformed to all the changes you made to the lines and everything else. If I then reset all these back, so I think it was line size of 5, and then I'm gonna have to move the threshold into 142, save, and then that restores us to our default. You can then go in, and one thing I like to do is filter, noise, add noise, and just add a little bit of noise to the lines, save that. And maybe not for this one, but for some images, it just helps you fill some gaps in. You can see you've got noise between the lines now. But yeah, my point here really was that this is fully editable. The action is not spitting out something that isn't rescuable. Like, no matter what it spits out, even if you put the wrong settings in, you don't actually need to run the action again. You can just go in and change everything. Like, it's all there in the smart objects. Nothing's hidden or like deleted or anything like that. Obviously, the more you change or add, you might stray quite far from the desired output for this action, but once you know the rules for something, like, you know how to break them essentially. So I don't know, maybe you'll come up with something that looks even cooler than this by just messing and just adding more filter gallery or messing with the luminosity and stuff like that. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you is how you can make an edit to this effect and save it as your own custom action for CRT Effects Kit. So I'm going to delete my output and I'm going to try it on this image of a parrot. So if you want to go about creating your own like preset for this, get any image you want, run the action till you've got whatever output it is that you want, like I have here. Then with the CRT Effects Kit May Update or whatever you're working in, a folder selected, click on the 3 lines in the action panel and click on new action. Name it whatever. So for this one, I'm just going to call it custom CRT edit, right? And then press record. Now at this point, just click stop at the bottom of the actions panel and make sure you have no layers selected. So just click on the empty space in your layers palette. So nothing's selected. Make sure you've not renamed anything or made any changes to the default output from CRT Effects Kit. Then press record with your custom action selected. So Photoshop's now recording everything you're going to do. And because we've already got this specific document set up, changes that you make will be able to be transferred to other PSD files and other documents if you've run the same CRT bend action in those documents. But the way we make sure this works, and the only way this works, is if you've not renamed anything or changed anything, basically. So now we're recording. If I select the CRT bend effects layer, you'll see on the left, it adds that to the action. If I then double click into the smart object, it adds that in. Let's say I want to record an action that changes the color to red. So if I deselect my base layer, select the hue and saturation layer and change the color to red. Let's say in my action, I also want to change the lines. I want to make some change to the lines. So I'll deselect my hue and saturation, select the base layer, double click again to go into that, then double click on my vertical lines to open this smart object up and double click again on filter gallery, change the line size to 9 like we did before, and then change the threshold so that the lines are still thin. So we've reduced the amount of lines there. So all I need to do now is Control S to save this smart object, exit that, Control S to save this one, exit that, Control S to save this one and exit that as well. And then just press stop on your action, and just to prove that that works, I'm going to delete my output there, run the advanced CRT bend again on this parrot. So I'm just going to go with default values again, just to show you that the output that I'm going to get here will still be the normal green that I got before. So as you can see, it's the same green default parrot that I got before. And if I now run this custom CRT edit with this list of changes that it's going to make and press play, it'll change the CRT effect to red and it will sync up the change that I made while recording that. If I close this now and try it on the eye and run the advanced first CRT bend on the eye with all the default values again. So we've got this green eye that we showed at the start. I run the custom CRT edit that I just made on the bird in another PSD file that is now gone and been deleted from my Photoshop. You can see it's not still open or anything. If you go to history, we've only just opened this one. So I run that now. It does the changes like synced up, no effort required, just in one click. So the last thing I wanted to show is people always ask me this on Instagram, so I'm going to show it somewhere. If you want to do a cool like before and after, just get your before layer and your after layer, highlight anywhere and just do a layer mask, unlink the layer mask, and then you can move around the before and after thing. I just had to show that in a video and it isn't worth its own video. So yeah, if you're one of the people who asked that, that's how you do it. Other than that, everything else I mentioned in this video will be in the description. This was the May free download. I've since done a couple more. So if you've not checked the site in a while, have a look at the new free stuff. I make one free graphic design resource every single month at studioAAA.com. So if that's the kind of thing that would help you out, or if you like stuff like this, subscribing or sharing this video with any of your creative friends would really help me out. Hope you enjoyed this video. When I watch it back, hay fever is really bad today, so hopefully my nose isn't too bright red and my eyes aren't too bad. But yeah, thank you for watching and I will see you in the next one.